April 9th, 1968, Ebenezer Baptist Church, Atlanta, Georgia. Outside, a line of mourners stretches for blocks under a gray morning sky, some of them having walked for miles, some having traveled overnight on buses from cities across the South. The temperature is already climbing past 90 degrees, and hand fans move in slow, uneven waves through the crowd waiting outside, printed with the faces of gospel singers and the names of funeral homes, doing little against the thick Georgia heat. Inside, the church is already filled past capacity, the air thick with heat and grief in equal measure, every pew pressed shoulder to shoulder, ushers standing at the back simply because there is nowhere left to seat them. 5 days earlier, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed on a motel balcony in Memphis. Today, the nation is trying and largely failing to find a way to say goodbye to him. Near the front of the church, a 26-year-old woman sits with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She has known this family since she was a child. She has sat in rooms where Dr. King and her own father debated strategy over coffee, has watched the two men bow their heads together in prayer more times than she could count. Today, she has been asked to sing one hymn, a song Dr. King himself loved, a song he had once asked to be played for him when he needed strength before he could find any of his own. She does not know yet whether her voice will hold, she only knows that she has to try. Her name is Aretha Franklin, and in a few minutes she will stand and sing Precious Lord, Take My Hand in a church so heavy with sorrow that witnesses will later say the entire congregation seemed to forget how to breathe. Stop. To understand why Aretha Franklin was in that church at all and why her presence there mattered as much as her voice, you have to go back to a house in Detroit where the line between the pulpit and the civil rights movement barely existed. Aretha Louise Franklin was born on March 25th, 1942, in Memphis and raised primarily in Detroit, where her father, the Reverend C. Franklin, built New Bethel Baptist Church into one of the most influential black congregations in the country. Reverend Franklin was not simply a preacher, he was a formidable public figure in his own right, a man whose sermons were recorded and distributed on vinyl records that sold in the tens of thousands, whose voice carried real political weight in Detroit and well beyond it. His home on LaSalle Boulevard functioned as something between a salon and a war room, where gospel singers, civil rights organizers, and community leaders moved through the same rooms on the same evenings. Martin Luther King Jr. was a frequent presence in that house. He and Reverend Franklin had known each other for years. Two Baptist preachers from the South who had both come to understand, from opposite sides of the pulpit and the picket line, that the black church was not separate from the struggle for civil rights. It was one of its primary engines. Aretha's younger sister Carolyn would later describe evenings when Dr. King stayed for dinner, the conversation drifting easily between scripture and strategy, the children of the house sent to a back room to play while the adults worked through the details of an upcoming rally in low, serious voices that carried anyway through the thin walls of an old Detroit house. Young Aretha grew up watching the two men talk for hours, sometimes about scripture, often about strategy, always with the particular seriousness of men who understood that the wrong word in the wrong meeting could cost lives. She was not a passive witness to any of this. By her teenage years, she was already touring with Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, donating her performances to fundraisers and rallies before most of the country outside gospel circles had ever heard her name. She would travel by car and by bus to small churches across the South, singing in rooms far smaller and far poorer than the ones she would later fill as a famous recording artist, understanding, even as a teenager, that the offering plate passed after her performance mattered more that night than any royalty check ever would. In 1963, she performed at events connected to the March on Washington, one voice among many lending whatever weight a name could lend to a movement that needed every ounce of public support it could gather. She understood, in a way few pop stars of any era have understood, that her voice was not simply a career. It was a resource that belonged, in part, to a movement larger than herself. That understanding would shape nearly everything that followed. In 1967, Aretha Franklin left Columbia Records for Atlantic, and in a Muscle Shoals studio session, followed by further recording in New York, she rebuilt a song Otis Redding had written 2 years earlier. Respect was, on its surface, a simple request from a tired man to the woman waiting for him at home. In Aretha's hands, backed by her sisters Irma and Carolyn spelling the word out letter by letter, it became something else entirely, a demand sung by a black woman at the exact moment the civil rights movement and the emerging women's movement were both reaching for language forceful enough to match what they were fighting for. The song reached number one on the Billboard Hot 100 in the summer of 1967 and never really left the culture afterward. It became, almost against its own will, an anthem. Dr. King reportedly kept a copy close at hand during his own final years, understanding, as many did, that Aretha Franklin's voice had accomplished something in 3.5 minutes that speeches sometimes took hours to attempt. It made an abstract demand for dignity feel completely, undeniably concrete. Stop again, because none of that prepared anyone, including Aretha Franklin herself, for what it would feel like to sing at his funeral less than a year later. On April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was assassinated on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. The news reached Detroit and the rest of the country within hours, setting off a wave of grief and unrest that would leave cities across America changed for years afterward. For the Franklin family, the loss was not an abstraction reported on the evening news. It was the death of a man who had sat at their dinner table, who had prayed in their living room, who had been, in every sense that mattered to a preacher's household, family. 5 days later, at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where Dr. King had co pastored alongside his own father, the funeral drew a crowd so large that only a fraction of the mourners could fit inside the sanctuary itself. Dignitaries, entertainers, and civil rights leaders filled the pews alongside ordinary people who had traveled great distances simply to stand outside in the heat and bear witness. Coretta Scott King, widowed only days earlier, sat with a composure that observers that day would describe, again and again, as almost unbearable to watch. The song chosen for the service, Precious Lord, Take My Hand, was not a random selection. It was a hymn written by Thomas A. Dorsey in the depths of his own grief after losing his wife and infant son. A song about reaching for guidance when a person has nothing left of their own strength to stand on. It was reportedly among Dr. King's favorite hymns, one he had asked to have sung at gatherings during moments when the movement itself needed steadying. Asking Aretha Franklin to sing it that day was not simply a request for a beautiful voice. It was a request for someone who understood, from the inside, exactly what the song was for. She stood in a dark, simple dress in a church so packed that the heat pressing in from thousands of bodies was reportedly visible in the way people fanned themselves, even in the middle of the hymn. She began to sing, and according to multiple accounts from people present that day, something in the room shifted almost immediately. Not because her performance was technically flawless, though it was, but because it was clear from the first phrase that she was not performing at all. She was praying out loud in the only language she had ever fully trusted. Her own voice, shaped by a childhood spent standing in choir robes beside women 3 times her age, singing songs written for exactly this kind of unbearable moment. But the truest part of what happened in that church cannot be measured in the notes she sang. It has to be measured in what the room stopped doing. Witnesses would later describe the congregation growing progressively stiller as she sang, the ordinary rustle and shifting of a large crowd falling away until there was, for those few minutes, almost no sound in the church beyond her own voice and the occasional muffled sob. A few rows back, mourners who had traveled hundreds of miles overnight, who had not slept, who had stood outside for hours in the rising Georgia heat just to be near this moment, found themselves, several later said, holding their breath without deciding to. Some who were present that day have said in interviews decades later that they could not recall breathing normally again until the final note had faded. When she finished, she did not linger at the front of the church. She returned to her seat the way she had walked to the front in the first place, quietly, without any visible need for acknowledgement, as though she understood that the moment had never been about her at all. In the years that followed, Aretha Franklin rarely spoke publicly about that day in great detail. It was not the kind of memory she offered up for interviews, and this account will not invent quotations she never gave. What is documented is simpler and, in its own way, more powerful. A 26-year-old woman, already famous, already carrying the weight of respect as an anthem she had not entirely asked to become, stood in a grieving church and did the one thing she had been doing since she was a child, standing beside her father's pulpit. She sang, honestly, for people who needed something to hold on to. Those who knew her well would later say that in the months following the funeral, she carried a particular quietness whenever the subject came up, the kind of silence that suggested the loss had settled somewhere private. somewhere she had no intention of putting on display for an audience, no matter how many times she was asked. The years that followed carried her further from that church and, in another sense, never very far from it at all. In January 1972, at the commercial peak of her career, she walked into her father's own New Bethel Baptist Church, not a concert hall, to record a live gospel album with the Southern California Community Choir. Amazing Grace became the best selling live gospel record in history, proof that the sound she had carried into Ebenezer Baptist Church in 1968 had never actually left her, no matter how many pop charts she topped in between. Through difficult years in the late 1970s, a triumphant comeback at Arista Records in the 1980s, and decades of performances that followed, that same quality kept surfacing, an ability to locate inside almost any song the exact note that mattered most to the people listening, and to hold it there until they felt it too. She sang at Barack Obama's first inauguration in January 2009 in a gray felt hat that became its own small piece of American cultural memory. She brought a sitting president to tears at the Kennedy Center honors in December 2015, rising unannounced from her seat in the audience to perform A Natural Woman at a piano no one had told her she would touch. In February 1998, given only 20 minutes' notice after Luciano Pavarotti fell ill, she walked onto the stage of the Grammy Awards and delivered Nessun Dorma in her own voice, proving once again that the boundaries other people drew around what she was allowed to attempt had never fully applied to her. On August 16, 2018, Aretha Franklin died at her home in Detroit, surrounded by family following a private battle with pancreatic cancer that she had largely kept out of public view. Her own funeral, held in the city that had shaped her from childhood, stretched across nearly 8 hours and drew tributes from musicians spanning generations and genres, a homegoing worthy of a woman who had spent her life carrying other people's grief as carefully as she carried her own. What she left behind extends well past the recordings and the awards. In an era when the line between celebrity and activism can feel manufactured, calculated for the cameras, Aretha Franklin's involvement in the civil rights movement was never a performance staged for publicity. It was simply an extension of the household she was raised in, where her father's sermons and Dr. King's speeches and her own choir solos were never treated as separate categories of the same larger work. When the movement lost one of its central voices in April 1968, it turned without hesitation to the one person capable of singing what could no longer be said in words. She did not fail that room. She never really has failed the rooms that needed her most, in any decade, for any cause, whether the ask was a hymn at a funeral or a demand for respect set to a 4-minute soul record that changed what an entire generation believed it was allowed to ask for. There is a particular kind of legacy that outlives even the person who built it, and it rarely announces itself the way a hit record does. It moves quietly, from one grieving room to the next, carried by anyone who has ever needed a voice steady enough to hold on to when their own gave out. Every time a congregation somewhere sings, "Precious Lord, take my hand" at a funeral, whether or not anyone in the room remembers Ebenezer Baptist Church in April 1968, they are, in some small way, standing inside the tradition Aretha Franklin gave everything to that day. She did not invent the hymn, she simply proved, once and for all, what it was capable of carrying when the person singing it truly meant every word. She rarely explained why she carried these moments the way she did. Perhaps she never needed to. The voice had always said it plainly enough on its own.